When we booked our trip to Antarctica, which was really Falkland Islands, South Georgia, and then Antarctica, it was all about the penguins. How many species would I see? What time of year was the best time to maximise going? And I paid little attention really to anything else.
14,200,000 square kilometers of ice, with an average thickness of 1.9 kilometers. The coldest, windiest, and most remote continent on Earth. Antarctica contains approximately 60% of the world's total fresh water. The Southern Ocean, circumnavigating Antarctica, is teeming with life. From krill and fish to whales, penguins, and seals, these species make up one of the world's largest marine ecosystems. Antarctica is a pivotal part of the Earth's climate system and the most sensitive indicator of environmental change. Understanding its past through scientific research of ice cores has revealed clear links between the Earth's rising temperatures and the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. With the Antarctica Peninsula one of the fastest warming parts of the planet, the ongoing scientific research into its past may help us importantly to predict how it's going to behave in the future.
So as our trip unfolded, we found out there was just an amazing amount of knowledge and information that was coming our way, which we just really hadn't expected. And our trip was gifted with some amazing guides. There were scientists, so climatologists, geologists, historians, ornithologists, and amazing people that had done some amazing things. And I learned, the first time I learned about the citizen science program. And that was really cool, something, again, we didn't really know anything about. So we left Puerto Madryn, it was in the sun, and it wasn't long before we saw our first whales. It was the southern right whales. Just a really small pod, there were just 2 or 3 of them, but we were all really excited at the sighting. And even more so, actually, I guess, when we learnt about the grim reality of how we nearly decimated this species in the early 1900s to the 1950s. They're beautiful, large, slow-swimming, curious and playful whales, but of course that meant they were very easy prey to the whalers. They are recovering now from that wipeout, but they still face really serious threats from industrial fishing, particularly at the border of the national waters in the Argentine Sea. So the first 2 days of our trip were actually at sea. So we left Puerto Madryn and we had 2 days at sea on the way to the Falkland Islands. That was super because we got to know our guides, we got to know what the program was going to be, and that was really helped us. We also had to get our sea legs. That was a little bit more interesting. We definitely learnt about the unpredictability of the weather from the get-go. As soon as we got to the Falkland Islands, we already had aborted landings just because of the weather, particularly the swell of the sea. And that continued on our arrival at South Georgia. But prior to that, we'd really started our lessons in climate change, both through some of the lectures that we'd had on board and then also this introduction to the citizen science program. And that for us on that trip was oceanology, marine biology, some ornithology, and meteorology. And we took part in things like counting specific birds, reporting back clouds to NASA, and learning how to spot identifying marks on whales and reporting it back to this website called The Happy Whale. We also did things like tested water temperature, salinity, and the krill content. And that was the one that I took part in. So a small team from the South Georgia Heritage Trust boarded the ship just before we reached South Georgia. And that was quite interesting. We learned an awful lot about what they've been doing cleaning up the island, not just themselves, but they worked very closely with the government of South Georgia and also the Friends of South Georgia too. But particularly we were interested in this eradication of the rats from the island. That was mainly the South Georgia Heritage Trust that were responsible for that, and it was a 5-year program. But they'd also, again, with the government and also the Friends of South Georgia, they'd eradicated the deer, a lot of the other pests that were coming to the island, and they'd also got rid of any of the plants and birds and things like that shouldn't have been on the island in the first place. So it was a real big clean-up for that area. They'd also cleaned up the seas, and the whales were returning gradually. And it's very rare, even if you stood on the shores of Grytviken there in South Georgia, that you could actually look out and see whales in the bay. For many, many years, you'd never been able to do that, and they were just returning. So it was really interesting. This very, very small team of people had achieved so much. It was just so inspiring. What I hadn't anticipated, though, was actually the impact of standing there at Grytviken. So as you approach it, so Grytviken's where the whaling stations were from the early 1900s to about 1960s. And as we approached it by ship, it was really interesting. You could see all the old buildings from it, but they'd really blended into the background, so didn't have the significance. But when we landed and we actually stood there, and we saw all of, whale bones, huge whale bones remaining in the area, and really looked at the whole processing plant. It evoked all sorts of emotions you can imagine. It was quite devastating, really. But at the same time, you have to not forget the history. But anyway, just stood there was quite incredible to feel and think about what we had done to eradicate so many species of whales. It's really easy to focus on the negative impact of the whaling industry, as I said, standing in that place and surrounded by those decaying buildings. And there was a big old rusting whaling boat with a very prominent harpoon, and it was just sat there decaying somewhat in the harbour. And it was really a reminder of how we pushed those whale species to the brink of extinction. But it's not so easy, if you look back, to think about that impact. If we if we look back in time and think, yes, they slaughtered all those whales, but actually it was providing oil and candle wax to illuminate their homes, and actually soap to wash with, which they didn't have at that time. So we just can't ignore that fact, and it's important, I think, that those buildings are still there to remind us of that.
Future generations cannot learn from history if we eradicate the visible signs and monuments from our past. The juxtaposition of the beauty and extensive wildlife on the South Georgia beaches and surrounding ocean compared to the aging remains of the Grytviken whaling station, where mankind nearly wiped out entire whale species, is a case in point. With so much visible evidence of human devastation on our wildlife, combining the then and now in this place will be tricky, but it seems art might provide a solution. Plans for the Grytviken Spirit Table sculpture, 7 large steel tables showing both the devastation of the 6 whale species in the Southern Ocean and, more importantly, their recovery, may be a way of expressing history and showing future hope.
One of our first landings was probably the most emotive. We arrived at Gold Harbour Beach about 5:30 a.m. in the morning. It was the only time we could land due to the weather. The sun was just rising, and the beach was just filled with wildlife. It just unimaginable, and it wasn't just visual. That impact was also the smell, the sound, the cacophony of the wildlife. and the distinct absence of the sound of humans. It was an incredible experience, and we all said afterwards that it was like a new dawning for us. And that was the moment, that was the aha moment. That was the moment when we realised this planet's so fragile and we're contributing to its destruction, and we have to do something about it. That was the time. So back on the ship, on the way to the Draugaski field, we sailed through this most amazing field of icebergs. You could feel the cold radiating off them as we sailed, pretty close to them really. And the wind, God, it was absolutely amazing. They cracked and they squeaked as they moved through the water, and they were caving and breaking into smaller pieces. And we'd had a geology lesson, interestingly, on identifying the different rocks. So as we'd entered the field, we were looking at 200 million year old rocks on one side and then 50 million year old rocks on the other. And our time as humans on the planet is just a pinprick, and it couldn't have been any more obvious than at that point. There was a lot of talk amongst our guides about the reduction of glaciers and how they'd seen them just disappear. And interesting, a lot of the guides have been on those trips probably for a good 10 years, so they'd really seen a difference. And actually it was pretty disturbing. It was for the passengers, we again really realized the impact of what we were doing on these glaciers, just hearing them talking about the disappearance of this glacier or that glacier. It was another sort of moment where we went, okay, we're really, really getting this. So man's always been interested in this region. If you look back in history, all the Antarctic polar explorations that have been, and one of the ones that's probably the one that most people know most about is Shackleton. And we were gifted with this amazing historian on our ship. So as a guide, he told us an awful lot about the history and reenacted quite a lot about Shackleton. But it's amazing, again, just to be there and just to see that, to see where, well, obviously not where the ship was rocked in ice, but to see where the men escaped from that eventually in their lifeboat and got to Elephant Island. And it's this tiny, tiny spit of land, and there's nothing there, really, really stark, just rocks, in a small sort of mountainous area. You think, how on earth did they ever survive that time there? And then for them to go from there across the sea in a lifeboat to try and get to South Georgia, and then arriving at South Georgia, the wrong side of the island to where the whaling stations were, and totally ill-equipped to do that climb that they had to do over snowy mountains to get to Grytviken. But they did that, this small team, and then Shackleton went back. I think it took 2 attempts before they could rescue his men, but went back to Elephant Island and rescued all of the men. And they lost not one life at that point from Elephant Island to South Georgia. Incredible leadership, and fascinating to think about those historic moments. Elephant Island is the tiniest, barest bit of land you can imagine, and how on earth Shackleton's men survived waiting for their rescue, goodness knows. So we had geology and climate lectures on board by a guy called Bob Gilmore. He was quite an amazing scientist. He'd been working on the McMurdo station for 4 years. Normally scientists are invited for 2, but he got asked back for another 2 years. So quite amazing that he was on our ship talking to us and presenting to us. And I'll never forget the last 2 days at sea. We coming back from Antarctica up to Ushuaia. And he gave us a presentation. It was called Our Changing World. And the amount of information he had, I'd never seen facts and figures like that. Obviously that was coming from his own research, but it was pretty scary stuff on climate change and how we had impacted that. And I just remember the whole ship lounge was full of, most of us were sat there listening to it, and we were all saying, what is it we can do? We have to do something to change. And a lot of people were saying, well, can I actually affect that as an individual? And he was saying, yes, you can. Every single little thing that you do makes a difference. And I'll never forget the impact of that last presentation. It was pretty somber, really, and I guess quite a somber note to finish on, but quite necessary. The interesting thing was it inspired, certainly for me, to become an ambassador for that area and to do something. I knew I wanted to do something. I didn't know what that was going to be or what it was going to lead me to. And I know I wasn't alone on that trip. So if those trips can create those ambassadors for that area and for our climate, to try and stop what we're doing to make the climate impact worse, then it's worth it for sure.
It's easy to think that you cannot impact or change the warming of our planet significantly, but every single little change you can make will result in a big difference and may inspire others to do the same. It doesn't matter whether it's walking rather than driving that short distance, taking your own bag to the shops, having a leftovers night rather than wasting food, refusing to support single-use cups, giving a gift of adopting a penguin or a whale, or shopping your own wardrobe rather than buying something new. There are many conservation organizations out there, often small, very targeted and achieving masses, such as the South Georgia Heritage Trust did when they eradicated the rats and cleaned up South Georgia. If nothing else, support these organizations so they can continue their work. All it takes is, for example, for everyone to donate the cost of their next coffee. Think of the difference that would make to our planet.